All right. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this session on governance and tax revenue mobilization, or domestic resource mobilization and governance. In many ways, I think this is the central question that we're debating at this conference, but also to keep in mind that the whole idea of taxation was originally a form of governance. You know, going back to the English Revolution in the 17th century, when the citizens introduced taxes as a way of reining in the king. But now we've evolved to a point where we find that weak governance actually makes it hard to collect taxes. And the papers, a very rich set of papers here, are all different attempts at different ways of trying to address that problem of weak governance and how we can improve upon it in order to do a better job of collecting domestic revenues. So let me start now with Sabine Laudage, who's going to talk about the effects of training tax inspectors on transfer pricing and how that affects domestic revenues. Sabine.
Yeah, thank you very much. So can you please share my presentation? So yeah, I'm an economist and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Münster and work at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. And I'm going to present a paper today on transfer pricing trainings in the Global South and whether they are effective, and particularly also in the long run, in mobilizing domestic revenues. So here, just a brief outline, but let me directly jump into the motivation for this paper. So it has already come up that transfer pricing and the mistransfer pricing is a main channel for multinational enterprises to shift profits from high tax to low tax affiliates, and as a technique of avoiding tax. And what is tax planning for the multinational companies is big revenue losses for the governments. So this is, of course, then now in the need of more revenue, even higher on the agenda to tackle tax avoidance by the governments. And one way is to introduce transfer pricing legislation. It's a very popular anti-tax avoidance rule. In 2019, it has been introduced by 177 countries worldwide. And the goal of this legislation is to tackle tax avoidance by transfer pricing and increase revenues from corporate taxation. However, this legislation can be very complex and can be very hard for tax administrations in audits to verify that a multinational group has mistransfer priced, kind of like has miscalculated the transfer price. And what is already difficult for tax administrations in high capacity countries is even more difficult for tax administrations in low capacity countries. And therefore there's a high request for technical trainings and capacity building in the area of transfer pricing. And this gap has kind of been filled by a not so new but still rather recent initiative, the Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative, which is a joint program by UNDP and OECD. Piloted in 2012 and really kicked off after the ADIS conference in 2015. And they are providing technical trainings originally in the area only in transfer pricing. Now they are even more broadly doing capacity building in other areas of international tax. And it's a program that is on request. So tax administrations in low capacity countries are approaching this initiative and request trainings in the area. So I'm interested in whether these trainings are, and particularly also in the long run, and the dynamic effects, effective really in mobilizing more domestic revenues, so corporate income tax revenues, and also what is the effect on the tax base. And I'm contributing mainly to the empirical literature, since it's an empirical paper. And there is already some literature out there which looks at effects of capacity building in tax administrations of developing countries on revenue mobilization. I only aware of one paper who assesses the Tax Inspector Without Border initiative. It's also still a working paper, but they're looking at the real investment effects. And other similar paper that also have like similar approaches are, for example, assessing the effects of large taxpayer units introduction or semi-autonomous revenue authorities. And my contribution here is then the first one to look at this Tax Inspector Without Border initiative, which gains more and more popularity and is introduced in many countries now, and what are the dynamic effects on DRM using cross-country panel data. And yeah, here an overview of the data set I compiled. It's actually all, or mostly all, free sources and publicly available. So it's a unbalanced cross-country panel data set of 140 low and middle income countries running from 2007 to 2019. And the variable I'm going to explain, the dependent variable, is corporate income tax revenue and also tax-based. So tax-based is revenue divided by the statutory corporate income tax rate. And then I'm going to look at the effects when a training got been introduced in the country. How is that changing revenue mobilization? So I have this treatment variable, which is an indicator that switches from 0 to 1 in the year a training starts, and the first training, because some countries even have several TIWB trainings. And I'm controlling for also transfer pricing legislation when it got introduced, and general anti-avoidance rules for the corporate income tax rate, for the overall capacity to tax, and then for other economic, socioeconomic control variables. And all the observations are on the country year level. Yeah, and so what I'm really assessing is the TIWB program effect, and this data I collected, yeah, it's really available on the TIWB website. There are reports on all the trainings. And I'm focusing on 29 programs that were running between 2012 to 2020, but have been really completed by 2020, since my panel data is not going longer, and also since all these programs are focusing on transfer pricing audits. And on the right-hand side, you see a graph then when countries started these trainings. So in 2012, Colombia and Kenya were really the first in a kind of pilot program of the initiative. Then Ghana in 2013 had a training, Senegal in 2014, 3 more countries in 2015, and then 2016 a lot of countries got their first TIWB program started. And the average duration is, in my sample, they are about 2 years and 4 months. And to say today there are even a lot more ongoing and also completed TIWB trainings, but I focus on these earlier ones. And yeah, so the aim is to get like, what are the causal impacts really of TIWB trainings, this capacity building on revenue mobilization. And my identification strategy there is to divide countries into a treatment and control group. So I have these 29 countries which received the treatment. They're the treatment group. And then I have all the other low and middle income countries who had not completed TIWB trainings by 2020. And within the treatment group, then I even, since we see in this staggered, on the right-hand side the graph, that they received the training in different years, there's kind of a staggered adoption. And to deal with that, I'm even separating the treatment group into different cohorts. So countries are in the same cohort if they receive training in the same year. And to then consistently estimate it, I have this dynamic difference in difference regression model. I don't want to go into detail in that. It includes fixed effects for countries and years, and the control variables I had on the data slide, and then I'm including leads and lags of when the training started, to estimate the dynamic effects. And the estimator is the interaction-weighted estimator. But let me directly go to my key results that I have for now. So I depicted the results in an event studies diagram. So just let me briefly explain. On the horizontal axis, you have the relative time to treatment. So in period 0, a country received TIWB training. It was in different years, so that's why I have relative time to treatment. And what we see in the years before the training starts, these are then the estimated coefficients of TIWB on revenue mobilization, on corporate income tax revenues, and they all include the 0, so countries followed similar paths prior to the TIWB training. And then we see that only in year 3 we have a positive coefficients, that is on a 10% level, it's significant. So these are the confidence intervals, the vertical lines. And then we see, that even in period 5, it goes until like 23% increase in corporate income tax revenues. So we see that it takes some time here, the training starts, and in 3 years after, until 6 years after, we see really a positive impact on the corporate income tax revenues, which ranges between 11 and 23%. So this is good news, of course, and what the program also claims, but nobody has like really empirically looked at it in a cross-country way. And I did the same for the corporate income tax base, which is revenues divided by the statutory tax rate, and there I find even a bit more significant and larger estimates, between 14 and 30%. And again, with this lag that we see the effect only kicking in 3 years after training started. And I think that's what I expected, because I said the average duration of a the training is about 2 years and 4 months. So it will take some time until the training is then completed, and then we see the effects. What is interesting is also that in period 6, we see the effect goes down a bit. So that's a question I want to investigate even more. Is there some kind of a fading out effect, maybe, that like companies adapt to it, to the higher audit risk, and And let me briefly. How much time do I still have? Yeah. Okay. So let me just very briefly. So what is always with cross-country panel data a pity? I have a corporate income tax revenue, but that's revenue collected from domestic and multinational firms. But the audits are only focusing on multinational firms. However, I don't have microdata on a big cross-country scale and as a panel. But therefore, I just selected one country where I have micro-level data on firms. That is Colombia, which is also an interesting case because it has a pilot program of TIWB, one of the first ones in 2012. It was a program for about 2 years and 7 months with 9 on-site missions where the tax inspectors were really sent to the administrations, and they claim to have been raised through the program $3 million in additional revenues through the audits conducting during the program. But the question is then, can we in the microdata really see that multinational firms in Colombia pay more taxes after the TIDW program took place, and again controlling for other legislative changes, etc., and characteristics of firms. And I'm using this firm level data from the Orbis database and estimating the effect of the program on effective tax rates of multinational firms, and then compare it to effective tax rates of domestic firms. So that's my identification strategy here. Treatment group are the multinational firms because they are targeted in the transfer pricing audits, and domestic firms shouldn't see a higher audit risk normally when this training has been completed. And again, it's a different diff model. And the results, it's again, I show it in an event study style graph to look at the dynamic effects. And again, we have this relative time to treatment on the horizontal axis. And we see really that after multinational firms are facing this higher audit risk because more auditors got trained in Colombia in the area of transfer pricing where the domestic firms shouldn't be affected. We see an increase in the effective tax rate of multinational firms of 3 to 8 percentage points. However, I still investigate there might be an upward bias because maybe domestic firms are less targeted in audits because more audit power is directed towards multinational firms, and that might lead to an upward bias in these estimates. Okay, I need to finish. So, the conclusion, I think, I hope this fills an interesting research gap, evaluating this large capacity building program of tax inspectors without borders and assessing it on long-run effects on revenue mobilization. And it seems to work, though in the cross-country panel data analysis, I'm still assessing, is there maybe also effect of fading out? And in the microdata, I also find interesting results, but still assessing, is it also having effect on domestic firms, maybe? And I'm also still, another thing I want to go is looking at whether, the intensity of training, how many auditors got trained has an effect also, whether more or less revenue is mobilized in a country. But overall, it seems to be a very successful program, and I think, an important area. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sabine. Very interesting. So let's now turn to Mohamed Traoré to discuss another form of trying to improve tax collection and revenue by cross-border information exchange. So, Mohamed, you have 12 minutes.
Okay. So, please, may I share my screen or?
Yeah, I think you can.
I cannot.
Lui, il va le faire.
I think he wants to share the screen so that
Yeah, so he can control it then. From Abidjan. Do you have the share screen option?
Yes, but it not work. It is not working. I don't know why. Or let's go. I don't know how to do, but I can start.
I mean, we have your presentation here, so we
Okay.
can. But the only problem there is you have to tell us when to advance it.
Okay, let's go.
Can you,
Please.
It's got its name, Ndoya. No, that's you. Sorry. It's got transfer price. Cross-border pricing. I mean, we have 5 presentations and 5 speakers, so.
The title of his presentation.
Well, I put these in themes.
Mohamed, what's the title of the presentation?
Yeah, there it is. That's it. That's it.
We'll run it from here.
Okay, so we're gonna run it from here.
Okay, thank you. This research paper focused on a cross-border exchange of information on tax revenue mobilization in Africa. The paper is co-written with Seydou Koulibaly and Yanis Avanitis. So the presentation will follow this outline: introduction, standardized fact, empirical analysis, result, and will end by some policy implication. Next, please. Tax evasion and avoidance are particularly high in African countries and deprive government from significant revenue. According to the UN CETAD 2020, the amount lost annually by African through illicit financial flow exceed 89 US billion. Which represent about 3.7% of the country GDP. The fiscal stress raised by the COVID-19 pandemic suggests that it is imperative for African countries to redouble effort to increase domestic revenue mobilization, as suggested by Koulibaly and Kamara. Informational asymmetry between taxpayers and authorities create opportunity for abuse of tax system. Thus, international cooperation through exchange of information between tax authorities is one of the policy options to stimulate tax revenue collection. Next, please. This research paper has 2 major objectives. The first one is to assess the impact of tax-related cross-border exchange of information on tax revenue for African economy, especially. The second is to provide policy guidance to policymakers to combat tax evasion and tax avoidance in order to increase their tax revenue. Yeah. Next, please. In this part, we provide some serialized facts on cross-border exchange of information in Africa. It is important to note that in 2000, the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes was founded, and published a list of 35 tax havens. Since it has been happening to non-OECD countries, there has been a progress uptake of the exchange of information in Africa. As suggested by the figures one, in 2014, only 7 Africa countries are joined the Global Forum for a total of 38 rescues and 279 received. In 2021, 22 countries are joined the Global Forum with 592 rescues and 1,618 received. These numbers show an increase in the exchange of information in African countries. Next, please. Yeah, the second figures show the average of tax revenue in percentage of GDP in the two groups of countries, especially the member of a Global Forum and the non-member of a Global Forum. The graph shows that over the entire period, the global membership countries perform better in tax mobilization than the non-membership countries. Next, please. We, following the literature on tax revenue collection, we specify the empirical model as follows. The tax revenue is a function of a Global Forum and also a set of standard determinants of tax revenue, including institutional and economic variable. The GFM, which is a dummy variable, which takes one if a country is a member of Global Forum and 0 otherwise. And X is a set of determinants that include GDP growth, digitalization, government effectiveness, trade open, natural resource rent, financial development, and official assistance development. So next, please. Yeah. So to estimate our model, we follow we estimate first by the panel fixed effect regression, and also we rely on a matching method to correct the selection bias in the participation of the Global Forum. Please go to the next. Yeah. So here we estimate the baseline specification using the fixed effect estimators. So as you can see, the coefficient of a Global Forum or the coefficient of the GFM is positive and significant at 5%. This suggests that joining the Global Forum initiative may increase the tax collection and performance. This could be explained by the fact that Global Forum member countries could benefit from an induction program whereby they receive support toward strengthening the technical and human capacity for tax audit and detecting tax evasion. So this could stimulate tax collection. Another explanation is that cross-border tax evader of host countries that join the Global Forum may reconsider their tax behaviors toward a better tax compliance. Please, next. Yeah, here we use the matching method to correct the likely endogeneity issue of the participation of the Global Forum. So the results suggest that tax revenue increase when joining the global forum. Yeah, business. We perform our analysis with some robustness tests. So as you can see, we use corruption, institutional variable like corruption. Fighting corruption stimulates tax collection. Also, more educated citizens can better understand how and why it is necessary to pay tax. We investigate also to the commitment to the automatic exchange of information. You can say committing to the automatic exchange of information offer an opportunity to encourage disclosure and strengthen tax compliance. Furthermore, we control the effect of the first exchange of information. The preliminary results show that indicate a significance when we take into account the limit numbers of exchange of information. This result provide a signal that increasing exchange of information would significantly boost tax revenue. Also, we include remittances to collect to capture revenue from diaspora. So the results show that large diaspora will be more interested in joining global forum tax because they have more reason to control asset held abroad. So please go to the conclusion. Yeah. So this paper provides the first empirical evidence on the impact of cross-border exchange of information for tax purpose on tax revenue for African economy. The results confirm that the exchange of information levels the playing field in terms of information asymmetry and boost tax collection. In fact, according to the result, joining the global forum increased tax revenue from 5% to 19% of GDP. So as a recommendation, we recommend policymakers to work toward greater collaboration between national tax jurisdictions for the exchange of information for tax purposes. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohamed. Let's have a round of applause. Excellent, and it was even with 2 minutes to spare. Okay, so now let's move on in this direction to Hermann Ndoya, who has a paper on resource mobilization and financial services, how the increase in financial services then improves our ability to capture tax revenue.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor to present this research paper entitled Resource Mobilization and Mobile Financial Services Africa, Does Financial Innovation Matters? This paper is still in construction. We are not still achieved, but we will present the intuition, the method, and the first result. So, our presentation, we follow this outline from motivation to policy implication. First, tax revenue mobilization is a central concern of economic policy making in many countries, especially in developing countries. Tax revenue mobilization is a central concern, and the importance of building tax capacity was underscored by the G20 leaders in 2010, who called on the IMF and Development Institution to monitor revenue mobilization efforts. So, as presented in this figure, a comparative analysis of tax structure in 2000 19, we can see that in the figure in the left side, African countries have the less level or the lowest level of tax revenue in percentage of GDP. But in the right side, and we can see the total of tax revenue in percentage of total taxation is high in Africa. This can imply some tax evasion in Africa. So, moving from the next figure with the tax components, including tax on income, social security, tax on property, it is the same concern. So, we can ask many questions. The first, how to mobilize sufficient tax revenue? What have other countries done to increase revenue collection at those tax reform matters? So, the World Bank has proposed 4 to 5 solutions to increase tax mobilization. The first is build trust and provide proof. So, citizens must trust their government. They need proof that their hard-earned resources are being used widely. The second solution can be keep the tax system simple. So, complex tax system foster a culture of tax evasion and create opportunity for corruption. The third solution was the broadening the tax base. So by broadening the tax base, it makes possible to reach a significant proportion of the population. So the last solution can be go digital. The simpler the tax system is, the easier it is to enable electronic payments. So moving in from the next step, when going digital, we can lead to mobile financial services, which is adopted in Africa. In this figure, we have the mobile money adoption in Africa. So in 2021, about 50 of 54 countries in Africa have adopted mobile money now. And it can be a great solution to mobilize tax revenue. So the mobile money in Africa, some global key elements. The level of mobile money or the revenue providing from mobile money in Africa is the highest worldwide. Why the innovation has been adopted for the first time in Philippines in 2001 and in Africa through Kenya in 2006. Today, Africa is the central of mobile money adoption and usage. So, conducting this analysis, we draw from data from Global System for Mobile Telecommunication Association, International Center of Tax Development, World Development Indicators, Worldwide Governance Indicators, on a sample of 42 African countries for the period 2000 and 2018. Our empirical strategy, we apply the propensity score matching, where tax revenue 1I is the level of the potential level of tax revenue in the country if mobile money is adopted, and tax revenue 0, the potential level of tax revenue is if it is not adopted. So the mobile money for a country E is given by the equation 3. So applying this method requires to move from two main assumptions. The first one is the common independence assumption, and the second one is the common support assumption presented by equation 5 and 6. So as a preliminary result, we first move to a logit estimate of the propensity score matching to find the determinant of mobile money adoption. So we can use revenue, education, urbanization, social globalization, And we can see that the main driver of mobile money adoption are education, labor force, and rule of law. So after estimating the logit model, we can now test our second assumption, the common support assumption. So the figure presented can show that the common support assumption is respected. So we have for each country who adopts mobile money, we can have in a control group, the country with the same characteristic. So we now estimate our propensity score matching using several algorithms to check the robustness. So the nearest neighbor, 1, 2, 3 radius, kernel, and local linear. So we can see that a positive and significant coefficient of the average treatment effect of treated of about 0.10. So it is equal to maybe 10%. And the result remain robust whatever the algorithm use. So we move now to another robustness check by dividing the resource mobilization in direct tax and indirect taxes. So the result remains significant, but the magnitude of the effect is more important for indirect taxes. Another robustness check is to move to an instrumental variable estimate. Why? Because one of the limitations of the propensity score matching estimate is that this method doesn't take into account the heterogeneity between countries. So Rosenbaum and others propose to move to a more robust method to correct this limitation. So we run an instrumental variable regression, and the challenge is to find an appropriate instrument. So we check 2 instruments. The first was urbanization. No, the first was mobile phone subscription, because the use of mobile money is only routed to the mobile phones. So we apply the same estimate for the total tax revenue, the direct tax and indirect tax, controlling from fixed effect. And now we also found a significant and positive effect, but with lowest magnitude. So our result can be summarized with the following figure, which present the level of tax revenue before and after the adoption of mobile money. So when mobile money, before the adoption, we have this figure, and after, we have the case in right. So we can clearly see that the adoption of mobile money spurs tax mobilization in Africa. So by concluding, we can say that the adoption of mobile money has improved the mobilization of tax revenue in Africa in about 11 to 15%. So the following implication can be emphasized. The promotion of mobile money will contribute to strengthening of transparency in tax mobilization and the reduction of corruption and tax evasion. So there is therefore a need to invest in infrastructure development to facilitate the access of ICT, for example, mobile phones. Okay, thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hermann. Let's move then on to the fourth speaker, will be Antonio Savoia, and he is talking about how constraints on the executive can lead to improved tax collection.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. And thank you, Shanta, for chairing the session. Today, I'm going to share some research findings myself, like other colleagues. And this is based in particular on a paper, a research paper that we have just completed. And it's myself, Antonio Savoia, at the University of Manchester, but I'm also a senior fellow at the UNU wider. And I've written this with a long-term co-author, Kunal Sen, the head of UNU wider, and also a colleague at the University of Manchester, and with a new co-author, Abrams Tagem, also based at wider. So this paper in particular, it's part of a research projects on fiscal states in developing economies that we have at wider, part of the larger program on domestic revenue mobilizations, the domestic DRM there. So what are we trying to do? Let me tell you a little bit about the perspective we bring to the session and the conference. I've learned a lot from day one on the day-to-day business of taxation, setting tax rates, understanding tax incidents. Here instead, we try to complement a little bit that. We are trying to bring here more a long-run perspective. Under which conditions do we learn to tax? So we try with panel time series data to look at what happened in the long run. And we try to argue that politics matters. And in particular, understanding the relationship between political institutions that place limits on the executive power can be important for taxation and vice versa. So we have here a political economy story. I think it was mentioned in the first session, setting the scene, was Thomas probably who said, understanding political economy mechanisms matter. And here we go, we try to do that. I'm probably not going to go through every slide. This is more a seminar presentation. I'll try to stick to the key message, and then I'm happy to take questions on methodology and the specifics of results. But essentially, what do we do here in this paper? In this particular paper, we test for co-integration. And so we want to see if constraints on the executive and tax revenues tend to co-evolve. In time series analysis, you can do that testing for co-integration. It tells you if there is a long-run relationship between the two variables. And that's the main empirical exercise we do. And here is the spoiler. We find that constraints on the executive and various measures of tax effort are in a co-integrating relationship. So they tend to co-evolve. This result is not the same for different types of taxes. We find that it's stronger for direct taxes, and in particular income tax, weaker for trade taxes, for indirect taxes in general. So we take that as evidence that probably not only there is a long-run relationship between constraints on the executives and taxation, but this relationship is probably stronger for certain taxes, direct taxes, because in the long run, countries learn to tax and tend to rely more on broad-based taxes. So on more sophisticated forms of taxation that require a greater organizational effort. Why should we ask this question at all? So a little bit on the motivation. I don't think I need to persuade anyone here that taxation is important. It's in the SDGs, so I'll leave that aside. In the academic debate, instead, we are trying to contribute to the broader literature on state capacity. So there has been this revival of interest in the role of the state. We think that effective states matter for development, and taxation is a strong part of that. But we don't really understand, especially from an empirical point of view, we don't understand a lot yet what are the determinants of fiscal capacity and of taxation are. So we try to fit into this debate purely from the academic point of view. So there is a gap in empirical research there, and we try to contribute to that. Now, a little bit on the hypothesis. So the key hypothesis here is that we think constraints on the executive and tax revenues tend to co-evolve. There is a feedback effect. They tend to support each other. Why? We bring here together ideas from economics and political science. In economics, colleagues like Tim Besley and Thorsten Pesson have argued that constraints on the executive are important for fiscal capacity. Why? Essentially, the intuition here, as Pranab Bardhan nicely puts it, is that if you have stronger constraints on the executive, this diminishes concern that the government will be run in the interest of a particular group. With stronger constraints on the executive, the executive may have a stronger incentive to invest in fiscal capacity because there is some accountability there. You know that the next incumbent will not use or cannot use, if his or her powers are limited, the tax system to redistribute to their cronies or to themselves. So that's essentially the story behind the arguments for executive constraints supporting fiscal capacity and then, in turn, tax revenues. What kind of executive constraints do we need? Here we don't say much in the paper, but constraints on the executive take different forms. Typically, the parliament, a parliament that can audit fiscal matters, audit the budget regularly. That is one broad example. If I had to think of an example of the last few weeks of executive constraints that work, and if you ignore them, you put yourself in real danger, I'm thinking of the UK example where I live. The Office for Budget Responsibility typically is the strong actor that regularly has a say on fiscal matters. Our executive a few weeks ago chose to bypass the Office for Budget Responsibilities, and we all know the consequences. It didn't go very well. But, okay, let's go to the other side of the story. Once you learn how to tax because you have a greater constraints on the executive, what happens next? And here we borrow from political scientists who have been arguing essentially that taxation calls for representation. It's not coincidental that the states that learn how to tax and tax more, then their executives face a stronger demand for accountability. Why? Because political scientists tell us that there is a contractual element in taxation. Citizens may want to pay taxes, but in return for that want some control on state activity. So this is in a nutshell the hypothesis that we have here. Constraints on the executive can support tax revenues and vice versa. There could be a feedback effect if constraints on if taxation as a contractual element. How am I doing with time? Not very well. We test this relationship then by breaking down tax revenues into different aspects, as I said at the start. But let me show you directly now some data and then some results. I won't say much more on the hypothesis. We stick to long-run data here. So methodologically here, these are kind of long-run mechanisms that we are testing. T is important. So methodologically, we stick to that. So we have a VDEM data and a data set that is for 31 countries and that political scientists Per Andersson and Thomas Bramborer have kindly produced and allowed us to use. But we have a T about 200 years. So we stick to that, and that's what our main results are based on a panel with long T. We tried also a panel with a much shorter T, but I don't have the results here, I can tell you later. Something a little bit about the data, the descriptives, and this gives you a hint of what you are going to see. These are 200 years averages of total taxes over GDP and executive constraints. There is a positive correlation here, a long-run correlation, quite a bit of variability unexplained, a sign that heterogeneity, country-level heterogeneity matters, but positive correlation. When you break it down into This is now, I replace total taxes to GDP with the share of direct taxes over total taxes, we still find a positive correlation. But look what happens if I replace the share of direct taxes with the share of indirect taxes over GDP. So this is an initial sign that in the long run, countries that learn to tax tend to shift to certain types of tax revenues and rely less on indirect taxation. I'll skip the time series here. I can discuss what happens there later, but I'm really running out of time. Methodology, panel time series. In one sentence, the advantage here is that we can allow for a different intercept and a different slope for every country we have in the panel. So that's essentially what we try to do. And we can account for cross-sectional dependence because it's a common factor framework, this one. We can control for unobserved time-varying heterogeneity. We estimate the dynamic version of this relationship for the reasons you can imagine. We want to see what happens over time. We want to test for co-integration, error correction, and do some causality tests, standard time series approach. Results, and I guess then I can go to the conclusions with the time I have. We find strong evidence of co-integration. These are co-integration tests. This is total taxes over GDP. Strong evidence. We reject the null of no error correction, so no co-integration, but the evidence is weaker once you allowed for an intercept and a trend when you have indirect taxes. So this is the type of result we have. Total taxation, strong rejection of the null of no co-integration. Direct taxes, the same result. When you go to indirect taxes, weaker evidence. And we break this down in further results into income tax, trade taxes, and any kind of particular category we can get from the Anderson-Bramborg dataset, and essentially replicates this pattern that I'm describing here. Strong evidence of co-integration for income taxation, a lot less for trade taxes. I don't have the time I have to go to wrap up the results, but essentially, what do we have here? Evidence that taxation and constraints on the executive co-evolve. This is not true at not the same strength of this relationship for all types of taxes. We run causality tests and mainly support the idea that the causality runs from constraints on the executive to taxation, but we can't rule out with the methodology we have that there is also evidence of a vice versa feedback effect. The main takeaway message here is that politics matters. Essentially, this is what the paper is saying. Politics matters, and you have probably at the same time not only do the day-to-day work of taxation, of technical fixes for the revenue administration. That's important, understanding all that. You also have to understand when you try to improve revenue administration performance, what are the political conditions you are facing? So that's the broad takeaway. If you like, you can say Rome wasn't built in a day. You need to look also at, patiently look at long-term aspects of taxation. Thanks for your attention, and I'm sorry I was not...
Okay, well, thanks very much. And our final speaker is Haldenwang, who's going to tell us about another important aspect of taxation, which is tax expenditures.
Thank you, Shanta. So this is a paper on tax expenditures and development. Some of you have been present yesterday when we presented the Global Tax Expenditures Database, the GTAD, which is the first database that covers tax expenditures worldwide. And this is a paper that tries to use this data to find patterns of tax expenditure use, in particular with regard to low and middle income countries. Sabine Laudage, who is sitting here, is a co-author of that paper, and any questions regarding methodology, I will pass it to her. Our colleagues from the Council on Economic Policies, Florim and Agustin, are also co-authoring. So, very quickly, for those who haven't been present yesterday, what are tax expenditures? When we talk about taxes, we talk about taxes that governments actually collect, and we criticize that they collect too much or too little or the wrong taxes. And we talk about taxes that governments are unable to collect due to tax evasion and tax avoidance, which is something that we discuss a lot in these days. But we typically do not talk about those taxes that governments voluntarily abstain, voluntarily sometimes, with a caveat, abstain from collecting, and these are tax expenditures. So departures from the normal or benchmark tax system designed to favor a particular activity or group of taxpayers. For instance, tax incentives to promote growth and investment, or reduced VAT rates to fight poverty, or very important in these days, corporate income tax deferrals to help companies survive the COVID-19 pandemic. These are examples. The use is very widespread. As I said yesterday, we are not talking about peanuts. This is not a minor issue. Tax expenditures are huge. Reining on tax expenditures, improving their use, has probably a very important revenue effect for many governments. We are talking on average from GTAD data of 3.7% of GDP and almost a quarter of tax revenue actually collected. You see that richer countries collect more in terms of GDP, but poorer countries, in particular low-income countries, are highly affected also with regard to their tax revenue. So we are interested in two issues here. First, we want to know which factors determine the extent to which tax expenditures are used by governments. So the extent of tax expenditure use is our interest. This is what I'm going to discuss here for the sake of time. We have a second question, what explains differences in patterns of tax expenditure use, where we look at types of tax expenditure used, where we look at beneficiaries and of tax bases that are objects of tax expenditures. So with regard to the first question, the dependent variables is revenue foregone in US dollars and also revenue foregone in percent of tax revenue. And we have GDP per capita as the main explanatory variable for obvious reasons. But we also look at reliance on natural resources and on trade as two economic variables. We look at liberal democracy index from VDEM and at control of corruption as two governance-related variables, and tax to GDP ratio and statutory corporate income tax rates as fiscal policy variables. The data is panel data, unbalanced panel data from the GTAD and from other sources from 2000 to 2021. The countries that are covered are the 102 countries that report on tax expenditures in the GTAD and the 116 countries or jurisdictions that are not reporting. This is ordinary least squares, fixed effects, panel regressions. We use interaction terms with GDP per capita to account for country income levels, and in order to address a reverse causality, which of course is a very important issue here, we use an instrument that is basically the lagged values of GDP per capita, and we use 3-year lags in order to be able to follow with the exogeneity criterion. Two caveats, two issues that we need to be aware of. First, as I said, tax expenditures are a departure from the benchmark tax structure. The benchmark is the national tax systems. National tax systems differ between countries, obviously, which means that comparing revenue forgone across countries is something that you should do with a lot of caution. It can be deceiving. So this is the first caveat. The second one refers to sample bias due to non-reporting. So here in these histograms we see, we depict reporting versus non-reporting countries and how they perform with regard to our controls. And we see that countries, that richer countries, to put it bluntly, report more compared to poorer countries. We see that with regard to trade, the graphs are similar, but countries with less trade exposure tend to report more. We see that the graph is quite similar with regard to natural resources, although at the right hand, non-reporting, we see that many the countries that are very rich in natural resources tend to report less. With regard to the statutory corporate income tax, it's also quite similar, but when you look at the left side, you see that countries with very low statutory corporate income tax tend to report less, which of course refers to the tax haven jurisdictions with low statutory corporate income tax rates. Countries that collect more taxes are also countries that tend to report more tax expenditures. More democratic countries report more, less democratic countries report less. And with regard to control of corruption, we also see that countries that have higher levels of control of corruption tend to report more, and countries that have lower levels of control of corruption tend to report less. So this is the obvious sample bias that we have to deal with when we try to make sense out of the data that we find in the GTAT and in other sources. So, key findings: GDP per capita is a key driver of the size of revenue forgone. This is not surprising. A 1% increase in GDP per capita is associated with a 1.78% increase of revenue forgone measured in US dollars. But when we measure revenue forgone as share of tax revenue, we see that we observe actually a slight decrease of revenue forgone associated with GDP per capita, which is understandable because, as you all know, tax revenue collection, tax to GDP ratio is positively associated with welfare levels. This is a very stable trend that we observe. So we have here an issue of endogeneity that is expressed in this finding. Other factors, natural resource rents and trade openness, have a negative effect on revenue forgone in our baseline specification, which is kind of unexpected. We would expect natural resource rents as well as trade to be positively affected, associated with revenue forgone. A statutory corporate income tax rate has a positive effect, which is expected if you have higher CIT rates. Of course, then if you grant tax expenditures on CIT, the effect is also larger, so it should be higher. Different patterns emerge when we split the sample into country income groups. So the effect of GDP per capita levels off at the upper end of the income distribution. It's not significant for high income countries anymore. And in contrast, we see that higher levels of liberal democracy are clearly associated with higher levels of revenue forgone in lower middle income countries. And we see that natural resource rents are not a relevant predictor of tax expenditure use in the group of low and lower middle income countries. They are relevant with regard to upper middle and high income countries. We think that here a third issue comes into play beyond the issue of non-reporting, that is under-reporting. So when we look at the extractive industries, we know that many tax expenditures are hidden in bilateral agreements, and they are not necessarily reported. And we think that this underreporting of tax expenditures can be a factor that explains this association. We interacted GDP per capita with our controls to tease out or to control for welfare levels. And these are the histograms that show how this is playing out. We see that liberal democracy tends to be more relevant for poorer countries with lower GDP per capita as a factor affecting revenue forgone from tax expenditures. But we always include the zero here, so it's not statistically significant. With control of corruption, the effect is stronger. With natural resources, you see that there's an opposite effect. So it's natural resources are more relevant as factors associated with higher tax expenditure in richer countries. With the other factors, I think it's difficult to draw conclusions on that. And perhaps this is a general observation here. It's we find that it's quite challenging, actually, due to the issues that I just mentioned, to get clear results, at least at this initial stage. We are going to look for other ways to make sense of our data. And perhaps you have ideas about how to do it. It's difficult because we have initial evidence that development factors, but this is far from being robust so far. We think that sample bias due to non-reporting endogeneity concerns are an issue. With our IV approach partly addresses the endogeneity issue, but not totally. We think that beyond improving our empirical design, country-specific case studies, small n comparisons could be helpful to deepen the analysis. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Christian. Okay, so we've heard 5 papers that are different, but in many ways there's some recurring themes running through them. So let's now open up. Why don't we take a few questions from the floor, and then and let us know to whom you're addressing those questions, and then we'll come back for a few more rounds. Yeah, I think we have 15 minutes. Yeah, the lady, Chiara.
No, thank you. Very, very interesting presentations. Very, very, really, I'm impressed. Also, these linkages between political economy or institutions and taxation. So my questions are a bit, one is theoretical to Antonio, which is, I have 2, sorry, but 2 different people. These panels that cover 200 years, and I'm just thinking about Europe and nothing else for the moment, okay? I just want to understand how do you correct for, in the 1900, Europe was a lot of wars. You were collecting taxes to pay for wars. Were they, how do you classify those, indirect or direct? It's just sorry, the intellectual curiosity, but I want to, because, you know, we are also in the developing countries, actually not only in development, we're affected by conflicts. And resources are paying for those conflicts. So it's just something that it would be interesting to learn or understand. Instead, on the tax expenditure, Christian, mining and extractive industry and the rent, I was really, indeed, surprised by the result myself. And I was wondering is whether, because of the definition of tax expenditure, a deviation from the norm, and often in the extractive sector, there are pre-agreements. And despite the efforts to make these agreements more transparent, and certainly we've made a lot of progress over the years, there's still a lot of agreements done below the count, basically, behind the norm, outside the norm. How do you, is that captured or you call it underreporting, but I wonder if it's, you know, we need to treat it differently. Basically, it requires a specific research. It's just a question, practical question. Thank you.
Actually, let me use the privilege of the chair to piggyback on Chiara's second question, the one to Christian, because I had this thought about that natural resource tax expenditure relationship. You know, you can think of tax expenditures as almost the government's last resort to being able to give certain benefits to certain selected groups of people. That you're trying to do it legally, do it in the legislation. And it could be that that's why liberal democracies use tax expenditures. If you're a natural resource-rich country run by a dictator, you can give it out for free. You know, you don't need to go through all this rigmarole to be able to translate. So tax expenditures is sort of the last resort. It's a way that governments can benefit their friends without, you know, in a legal way. Okay, that's just a hypothesis. François. Oh, you have a mic already. Okay, he's got the mic.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the very interesting presentations. My first question would be to Sabine, and it's very interesting to see that also transfer pricing is being covered here. And myself, I was a transfer pricing advisor for several years, so I know I have the perspective from the outbound countries, the headquarter countries, but it's also very interesting to see that the Tax Expenses Without Borders initiative and the idea to cooperate and have also capacity building programs for tax transfer pricing audits is empirically successful and was able to increase domestic resource mobilization and corporate income tax in developing countries. My question is whether you also could observe certain patterns in terms of challenges that tax administrations in developing countries face. Because I know, like in Germany or in Europe, transfer pricing is the hot topic in tax audits. It's always been covered, and there are several things like intercompany loans, financial transactions, but also IP is a very big thing. But I think the structure of the economy and the businesses in developing countries differ from the headquarter countries. So maybe you could give maybe some practical examples on that. If you have any or observed any. And I have a second question to Mohamed and the exchange of information that also tend to have a positive empirical impact on raising taxes in developing countries. And I would be interested in also to make a link to the automatic exchange of information. And here are also some challenges for developing countries, because you need to have an infrastructure and setup in order to, you know, be part of the automatic exchange of information, which is also challenging, especially to developing countries, because you neither have to build up the infrastructure from scratch, or you have to purchase a very individualized infrastructure for your tax administration. And I heard and read that there are also many challenges for developing and emerging countries to participate in this automatic exchange of information. So maybe, Mohamed, if you have any experience also on this topic, it would be great to hear a bit more from your personal experience. And I think it was Liberia, right? If I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much.
Okay, just one more question, and then we'll come back for responses. Otherwise, we'll forget. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I must say that I enjoyed very, very much those papers. Maybe especially the paper by Antonio really was about a topic which I tried to emphasize on the first day. On this paper, my question about this exercise is, I have two questions. One is about the relevance of co-integration techniques on a very long period where we basically expect a lot of change of regimes. And we know that if there is a change of regime, then co-integration will I mean, we would have to deal with co-integration in a different way, trying to figure out where are the change of regimes. And because you are dealing with co-integration on the cross-sections of countries, this is still more difficult. So I believe this is a point that you should take into account, maybe looking at the result that you get on shorter periods and trying to make some experiments about this. The other worry I have is about this kind of variable that you have when you talk about control of corruption, control of the constraint on the executive. These are variables which are not truly continuous, and they are really discrete to a large extent. So because of that, they are not really well adapted to a co-integration exercise. And again, I think that this is something that you should take into account. Maybe relying more to make the argument that you make, and which I believe is a very, very important one, maybe to rely more on standard descriptive statistics to start with. On the tax expenditure paper, I think it is again a very, very interesting paper on a topic which is very, very important. My worry when I was listening to Christian was what do we call tax expenditure? You are calling tax expenditure something which is official, where there is a piece of paper saying that this person will not pay the income tax because of this, because of that. Now there are many tax expenditures which are a bit like what Shanta said, which are unofficial. So I'm wondering whether it should not be important to make the same kind of analysis with compliance rates, for example. On the income tax, for example, we know more. We are more or less able to find some rough estimate of compliance rate, and to see, and this would be quite interesting to see in the compliance rate how much can be explained by official tax expenditures and how much is not explained by that. And this would tell us something about the way in which the tax administration is actually working. But in any case, I think it was really a very, very interesting paper.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's go back and get some answers for these very interesting questions. Let me start with Mohamed, because you're online. So there was this question about the automatic exchange of information.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hold on one second, Mohamed. Christian has a question.
I have a question to you, Mohamed, as well, because in your last slide, you talked about that membership in the Global Forum would drive, if I understood well, the tax to GDP ratio would be associated from 5% to 19%. And this is a revolutionary thing, right? It would solve all the issues the Bretton Woods institutions have with raising the domestic revenue mobilization only through membership with the Global Forum. So could you explain what you meant when you said from 5 to 19% of GDP, please?
Okay, thank you. For the first question, how the automatic exchange of information work? So the automatic exchange of information require a financial institution to report financial account information of a non-resident to the tax authorities, who in turn automatically exchange this information with the tax authorities. Yeah. So following the common reporting standard. So as you know, in this time, there is some improvement in tax administration in many African countries. They try to improve, use some technology to improve, to limit corruption or to improve governance in tax administration. So it could be some time easily to implement the automatic exchange of information. So regarding the percentage, so this is an estimation. As you can see, it is the regression. So this is the result we found. But what we can see, we have some limit information in terms of data or the risks sent or the exchange of information. The number is slow limit. This is we have to find some good explanation of the result. But what I can say, it is a preliminary result. We have to work on it to have some improvement or some argument to that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So then, there seem to be the, one question for Sabine, and then.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a comment in question on whether I have more practical examples on what kind of audits are conducted in the countries, as I think. Yeah, okay. So the data on the transfer pricing tax inspectors with a border initiative I got from these reports, which are publicly available. And so what they are saying, they're really doing training staff and conducting with them hands-on audits together. But there's not information like what kind of audits. Are that audits of firms in the extractive industries? Are that audits on on intangible assets? So there I have no information. What the reports include is there's really a building up of confidence of the staff. And so the way how they go then in the audits with these big multinational companies that have a big range of advisors from law firms is really the change maker kind of, and then that they for 2 years they are like accompanied by tax experts from other tax administrations, mainly from the global north. But yeah, it would be interesting to know more about like which companies were audited during these trainings, but I don't have it, so if anyone knows about the data on that, I'm happy to know it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So then let me go to Christian next to answer those questions, and then since Antonio has the most questions.
Yes, and well deserved also. I've also found this extremely interesting. But very good observation from Chiara and excellent advice from François. How do we deal with this suspicion of widespread underreporting, in particular in the range of low and lower middle income countries? And there is no easy way actually to deal with this, at least at this level of aggregate analysis. I think what we can do and what we probably will do is to get a clearer picture at the country level to complement this analysis and to see if we find more information about the actual extent of underreporting in individual countries. This is something that we could probably do in the course of our GTET-related activities. An excellent advice from François, because if we would include compliance rates, this would give us an additional indicator of the quality of tax administration, of the tax system in general, actually. It would also be governance related, of course. And I think it could be, this could be an interesting complement for our analysis. We are also thinking about, but perhaps as an additional paper, to look at how tax expenditure respond to shocks, which of course is also of very high interest, because we see now with COVID-19 and with the energy crisis that governments respond to shocks by using tax expenditures. So knowing more about this relationship would also be actually quite interesting. But thank you for the two comments. Shall I pass directly on?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the questions. So I guess the questions I've received, they are related because they are both about data and methodology. So regarding Dr. Bronchi's question, Do we know if in the face of external conflict, it's more direct or indirect taxes that react most? What I recall from the descriptive evidence we have is that clearly you see an uptick in total taxation, and probably this uptick is more evident for direct taxes, but it's not absent for indirect taxes. So the descriptives were telling us that war made states. So that hypothesis is in the descriptive evidence. I don't know to what extent we can disaggregate this with the Anderson-Bramber dataset we have. They've been amazing to put together this historical dataset, but the level of granularity we could explore was limited. But the point is has broader relevance. That's why it's interesting, this point made, because the question here is methodologically, what happens when you see this kind of major events, major shocks? And takes me to Professor Bourguignon's question, is what happens in the data here methodologically? How should you address this? The confidence I have is that we should be okay in this sense, is that because the common factor framework allows us to include in the analysis weak and strong factors. So the time varying and observed heterogeneity of various forms that includes shocks due to crisis or trade agreements or even conflicts at local or regional level. But your point is absolutely well taken. I think probably, and I'll take your suggestion, we should have also, and we haven't done that yet, broken down the co-integration tests into different periods, just to see if there are any major differences between periods before and after a major shock, like a war. I think it's a very good idea. We'll do that. The problem we may have is that we would be testing for the integration on a shorter T, but it's still a good idea because it will add to the robustness. And the other thing now that you make me think we should done, again, methodologically, is to explore the possibility of testing for structural breaks, because I think that would be interesting in itself. Although, we have my trusted expert on the panel time series, Abrams, our co-author, is very conscientious and knowledgeable, much more than me on this. But I think those suggestions, testing for structural breaks, exploring sub-periods, probably will add even more confidence to the results. But thanks again for the questions. I take that more or less you like the paper and it was not a bad idea to write it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end, but this has been a really rich discussion. If I reflect back, when we talk about increasing tax revenue, there are at least three components. There's information, there's capacity, and there's politics. And I think in this session, we've covered all three, and the papers have really increased our understanding of all three components. So I want to thank the presenters for a very interesting set of papers and very nice presentations, and for keeping to time, and to the audience for their questions and participation. So join me in applause.